Ladies and gentlemen, I give you now Senator Chris Murphy.
Well, I apologize for that drama. Thank you very, very much for having me here today. I'm sorry that I'm slightly belated in getting to you today. It's a long drive down from Cheshire, but I'm very, very excited to have the chance to spend a little time with you this morning to give you some remarks on some of the priorities that I've heard from you that drive my work in Washington, that matter here in southeastern Connecticut, and then hopefully to take a little time, if I can, to field a few questions because I will not cover the waterfront of issues that are of importance to all of you and are dominating the headlines today. Let me just first and foremost say thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. This state means the world to me. I grew up here. My parents both grew up here. They spent their summers as children on the shoreline. This is where I spent my summers and where I bring my children every summer. I just can't believe that I get the chance to represent this state that's meant so much to me and my family in the United States Senate, that I get to follow in the shoes of people like Chris Dodd and Joe Lieberman and Abe Ribicoff. And I am at the beginning of my second term. I have loads that I want to do and accomplish, but I am always seeking to add to my list. And so whenever we are on break from voting in Washington, as you know, I'm back here in Connecticut. I'm back visiting businesses and civic groups, churches and schools as a means to try to get smarter and better. And once again, in about a month or so, I will do my annual walk across the state, which is a great means for me to ground myself in what matters to folks in the state who may not be actively members of a chamber of commerce or a Civitan club, but still have as much right to tell their senator what they want to happen, and as a way for me, I hope, to just display my enthusiasm for trying to do this job right. Let me thank the Chamber and your leadership. Thank you for just being inventive and proactive in the ways that you continue to sell and market Mystic and Groton and New London and this corner of Connecticut. Let me thank Rob Simmons for being such a great champion of Eastern Connecticut writ large, and for being a friend and counsel to the delegation. Thanks to Keith for being here from Groton, and as well to Mike from North Stonington. There are many, many other VIPs in the room here today. I really was trying to think about what I wanted to talk about this morning, and again, I want to field some questions as well about issues that are pending. I wanted to maybe focus my remarks on two subjects that dominate my work in Washington, and they won't be unfamiliar to you. One is my paranoia that Connecticut is not going to be ready for the boom of manufacturing work that is coming to this state, and in particular to this region of the state. And second is the work that we can be doing a much better job of in Washington to try to leverage the economic engine of the water. It's our cultural, economic heritage, the Long Island Sound, and there's such a greater partnership that Connecticut and the shoreline communities can have with Washington, D.C. And so I have taken up these two charges. What you sort of learn in the United States Senate and in the Congress is that when you get to the Senate, you almost sort of feel like a kid in a candy store, because there's only 100 of us, and you can work on and be relevant on almost any issue you want. and that's a gift. But what you find is that if you want to be really good at this job, if you want to be effective, you've got to focus, right? You've got to find a handful of topics and interests that you are going to drill down on and make a difference on. And so two of the topics that I've decided to focus on are one, manufacturing training and workforce. That's why I sought out positions on both the Appropriations Committee. I'm the first Connecticut senator to sit on the Appropriations Committee in about 35 years, but also the Education and Labor Committee that oversees all of the workforce training programs. But I've also decided to have a focus on Long Island Sound. Many of you might have seen the big Long Island Sound investment plan that I released about a year or two ago, and part of the reason why I'm also on the Appropriations Committee is to try to make sure that we are plussing up those partnerships that I talked about. So first, let me just talk about the manufacturing economy. Listen, you all know what is happening here. From 2016 to 2018, Connecticut created over 4,000 manufacturing jobs, and that is significant because, as you know, we sort of spent much of the last 2 decades under the impression that manufacturing was just inexorably and inevitably leaving not just this state but this country. We sort of came to believe that we were in the midst of a permanent manufacturing decline. That was not the case, and in fact we have seen manufacturing jobs come back to the United States but also to our state. And today, as we speak, we've got 3 Virginia-class submarines that are in various states of construction in the waterfront at Electric Boat. This is a big, big deal, and the new budget that the president has proposed, which may or may not be adopted in whole by Congress, has record amounts of funding for submarine construction, $12.2 billion, which envisions 3 Virginia-class submarines being built in the coming fiscal year, and of course the beginning of these new big ballistic missile class submarines. That is a tremendous opportunity for Connecticut, but it stands next to other opportunities as well. Engine production at Pratt & Whitney is ramping up. They've got a brilliant new commercial engine and military sales that are piling up for the F-35. Sikorsky, which is sort of at an interesting inflection point because the Black Hawk program is winding down, is starting to win new contracts for other next-generation helicopters, and the Black Hawk replacement is coming. And Sikorsky signed a new contract with the state of Connecticut to stay here for the long haul and make a new commitment to the Connecticut industrial pipeline. And so all of this is great news, except for the fact that we don't have the people to do these jobs today. And so our focus has got to be laser-like on workforce development, which is why I was so excited to have the Secretary of Labor here a couple weeks ago. I invited Alex Acosta to come here and spend a day with me in Connecticut. In eastern Connecticut, looking at the eastern Connecticut manufacturing pipeline up close with me. I did this for a day about a year ago. I spent the whole day just sort of traveling to different players in the pipeline, and I wanted the Secretary to do it as well. And as you know, I'm fighting the Trump administration every single day on something terrible that I think that they're doing for the country and for the state. I don't hold back on the fact that I think that this is a backwards administration that's really bad for Connecticut in many, many ways. But what I said at the outset was that, notwithstanding my revulsion to many of the priorities of this president, if there's ways that we can work together to create jobs here in the state, I'm going to do it. And I think that's Joe's perspective. I think that's Dick's perspective as well. And so I was glad to welcome him here. His eyes were opened by what you all are doing, by the magic of this pipeline, which has already trained over 1,000 workers from beginning to end, is starting to gear up to meet these new challenges that are going to be presented as we have to hire and hire and hire through the pipeline that feeds Electric Boat. And I feel like that $6 million seed grant that we got from the federal government to start up the pipeline is just the beginning. I feel like we have the Department of Labor at the federal level bought in. But we have so much more work to do because our problem now is, yeah, we still don't have as many slots as we'd like, but we need the people to fill the slots. And, as we sat around with the secretary talking to all the folks who make up the Eastern Connecticut training pipeline, he asked a simple question. He said, are guidance counselors rewarded for sending kids into the pipeline, right? For sending the kid to the job interview, to the test that you take that allows Electric Boat to hire you and send you into the training program at Quinnebog or somewhere else for free. And every single person around the table had the same answer: no, guidance counselors at high schools are still not rewarded for sending kids into manufacturing, that they still are myopically focused on getting kids into four-year degree programs. And that's wonderful. That's right for many, if not most kids, but we have to rethink the entire way that we educate our kids and we think about elementary and secondary education. We've got to get kids exposure early on to these amazing careers that exist in manufacturing, because if we don't, then we can create all the slots we can in the pipeline, and there won't be anybody ready to fill them. And so that's a challenge for all of us going forward. Of course, all the rest of our economy drives off of manufacturing, because every single manufacturing job has 2.5 other jobs that are created because of it. I remember doing I spent a couple weeks just trying to trace the impact of jobs at one company in New Britain, Connecticut, back when I was the congressman from that part of the state. And I traced them all the way back to a little diner in Plainville, Connecticut, a diner that happened to be on the route to work for a handful of people that worked at this manufacturing plant. And they had gotten a big federal grant because of some work we had done. And I walked into this diner who said, yeah, the fact that that plant now has 35 more employees, it means we have a couple more regulars every day coming in for breakfast and stopping by on the way home, and that's made a big difference for us. And so the trail of these jobs is tremendous. We're going to continue to work on that pipeline. We're going to continue to work on getting federal investment in, and we're going to continue to challenge all of you to do the work on the front end, because these dollars are coming. When we're building 3 Virginia-class submarines and a Columbia-class submarine at Electric Boat, we're going to need to be in top form, because we've also got to supply workers for Pratt and Sikorsky as well. Great news for us, but a big challenge. Second, I wanted to just touch on the work that I'm doing on Long Island Sound. What a success story our commitment to clean water has been. Listen, we still occasionally have a beach that gets closed down for a day or two, but not like it was when I was growing up here in Connecticut. The Sound is cleaner than it ever has been before. The rivers that flow into the Sound have fish running through them. Up in Waterbury, Connecticut, where I'm from, the Naugatuck River, now has people canoeing and kayaking and people catching stuff out of it in a way that did not happen just 10 years ago, just 20 years ago. And as you know, here in southeastern Connecticut, we have shellfish returning to the Sound. We have the ability to really recapture not all of the fishing jobs that we once had here, but a serious industry once again returning to the water. And much of that is funded by the federal government. But we've been a minor partner, not a major partner, but that is starting to change. We have a specific program that funds Long Island Sound habitat and water quality programs. It's called the Long Island Sound Geographic Program, and President Trump proposes to eliminate it every year. It was funded at $4 million a year for a long, long time, and $4 million a year is nice, but we split that money with New York. And it was my priority when I got on the Appropriations Committee to dramatically increase that money. And so the first year that I was on the committee, we increased it from $4 million to $8 million. Then the next year, we increased it from $8 million to $12 million. And we have not done our budget yet in the House, in the Senate, but the House version of that appropriations bill this year has it marked at about $20 million per year. That would be, in about 4 years, a five-fold increase in the amount of money that the federal government sends us to help clean up the water and restore habitats along Long Island Sound. That is an enormous, important investment, and we are putting that money to work right now. So there is really good news when it comes to the federal government's investment in the work that we are doing to protect Long Island Sound. But there's a couple other pieces of good news that I wanted to share with you. One is something called the Atlantic Marine Monument, which is essentially a national park out at sea, a way to preserve habitats offshore, which can preserve fish stocks, which can make sure that we have recreational opportunities. And the folks that are going to be doing the protecting of that monument are right here in Connecticut. The money that is coming to Connecticut, maybe as much as $500,000, may come right here to Mystic, may come to the aquarium and to the researchers that do work here today. This living monument out at sea that we are in the process of authorizing and funding, the stewardship of it may be centered right here in Mystic, right here in southeastern Connecticut. A really exciting development for Connecticut and for the country. It's otherwise known as the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts Monument, and it's something to pay attention to moving forward. Third, I wanted to talk about Plum Island for a second. As you know, Plum Island means a lot to us, and we bristle at the notion that it is going to be sold off to the highest bidder. Now, we've been successful as a delegation in preventing that sale the last few years, but we are going to seek in this year's appropriations bill to have permanent protection of Plum Island, to say once and for all that you can't sell this asset off to the highest bidder, that it's got to be preserved for the long term. We hope to be successful, especially now that we have Democratic control of the House of Representatives. And finally, a new piece of legislation that I've been working on for the last couple of years. It's called the Living Shorelines Act. We've got to have a bigger, broader conversation about America's commitment to climate change. I just lose sleep at night as the father of a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old thinking about the fact that if we don't get serious about this existential threat to the planet, it will be too late for my kids to solve. But as we try to tackle this question of how to prevent climate disaster, we've got to be doing mitigation and adaptation. And you are, right now, all along the shoreline. You should have a bigger partner in the federal government. The Living Shorelines Act is a piece of legislation that seeks to try to put money behind what we call green infrastructure rather than gray infrastructure. You can just put up a seawall, you can put concrete between us and the water, but science and research actually shows that green infrastructure, marshes and new ecosystems, grass, can often be a better barrier, and one that frankly connects us to the shoreline to the water more directly. And so the Living Shorelines Act would sort of put some expertise about green infrastructure in the federal government and set up a small but meaningful federal grant program that could come down to states like Connecticut to make investments in new ways to protect ourselves from the water in a way that keeps us connected and keeps habitats and ecosystems alive. And so it's a pet project of mine, and we've got some new momentum behind it. So I just wanted to share with you some of that work that's happening that I think really matters to you here. I guess I'll leave you with this. I talked about my walk across Connecticut that I do every year. And, I'm not talking to you about the Russia investigation this morning. I'm not talking to you about what's happening in North Korea or Iran. I'm happy to take those questions. All of that stuff really matters. But the reason I do this walk across Connecticut is because it's grounding. It's grounding. Some of my Democratic friends got angry with me when I came back from my walk a year or two ago, and I said openly on TV a number of times that not a single person on my walk talked to me about the Mueller investigation. And not because it isn't important, not because I don't care about the future of American democracy, but the walk and all the time I spend in Connecticut is a reminder to me that the things that populate the cable news shows at night are not really what matters to everyday folks in Connecticut. It's not that they don't matter. It's the same stuff that matters to people in Connecticut. It's whether they have enough money to pay their bills. It's whether they think they may go bankrupt because of an illness that their child takes on. It's whether they got a good school to send their son or daughter. It's the worry that comes with not knowing if you're going to have enough to retire on. And I constantly believe that Washington is focused on the headlines and focused on the salacious stories and not focused on these bread and butter issues. And so I share with you my work on the manufacturing pipeline and Long Island Sound, because those are the things that drive those concerns. Those are the investments that make sure that we have good jobs that pay with healthcare benefits, that we have a tourism economy here that can employ people, and so that stuff might not be the headline grabbing work that we do. That might not be what I get invited on Morning Joe to talk about, but it still matters to me. And the time that I spend here with you, the time that I spend walking across the state reminds me of that. Thank you for everything that you do for Connecticut's economy. Thank you for everything you do for the delegation to make us smarter and better on your behalf. It is absolutely the honor of my life to get to do this job and to share some time with you this morning. Thank you very much. Can I take a couple questions? I'd love to take, I know people got busy days and I know I was a little late, but I'd love to take a couple questions on sort of hot topics of the day and or anything you want to talk about, and then we'll get on our way.
Chris, thank
Yes.
you for coming. I have to bring up the I word.
Yeah.
And by that I mean infrastructure. And I want to drill down to the T word, which is transportation. We heard from Dan Meisner earlier today that we are becoming a center in Mystic for culinary tourism. We hear from Jonathan Reiner about how they want to bring up more of the people who are working in Groton to stay in Groton. None of that's going to happen if we don't find a way of having good local transportation. We have to find out how we can get federal government aid to create a proper transportation route so the millennials who want to come and work at EB are going to want to stay in town. They like to park their cars. With proper transportation, people from New York to Boston and further can just come to town and not worry about the automobile. So can you give us a little idea about what you can do about that? There's some very good plans on the drawing board, but they never get past go.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I certainly can. As you know, Representative Cordy and myself have been championing local rail infrastructure. We've got a lot of work to do to sort of rebuild the spine of rail that runs up and down eastern Connecticut, but we got a major federal grant to start doing that. And the first step is to sort of modernize the commercial rail infrastructure up and down eastern Connecticut. And then once you do that, it's an opportunity to build passenger service on top of it. But let me sort of step back for a second and sort of talk about where we are. So most states, when you look at the overall amount of money that they're spending on infrastructure, are spending, probably somewhere between 40 to 50% in state dollars, and the rest are federal dollars. So 50 to 60% are federal dollars. The federal government requires you, if you want to get any federal money for infrastructure, for any of your roads or rails, to spend at least 20% state dollars and 80% federal dollars. When Dan Malloy became governor, we were spending the bare minimum as a state. We were spending 20%. And so 80% of Connecticut's dollars on infrastructure were federal dollars. Malloy got that number back up to around 30%. But that's still low. And so, I know the legislature in Hartford is in the midst of this big conversation about what to do about tolls, but whatever you do at the state level, you've got to plus up the state commitment to transportation because we're an outlier with respect to other states, and so we shouldn't be scratching our heads why we have a hard time, putting together local infrastructure plans to make sure that people can get to and from work. We're spending pretty abnormally low amounts of money in state revenues on transportation, and so the state's got to figure that out one way or another. But the federal government can be a much bigger partner in all of this. I don't think we're doing a transportation bill in the next year. I just don't. I think this president. Listen, I don't want to be too political, but I think this president is incapable of cutting a big deal like that. And the meeting at the, White House, the series of meetings at the White House are an indication of that. The first meeting sounded good, but it. because the folks came out of there and said they had a commitment for a $2 trillion infrastructure bill, but the president hadn't thought through it at all. The beginning of the meeting started with the president committing to a $1 trillion infrastructure bill, and then somebody in the meeting said, well, why don't we make it $2 trillion? And the president said, yeah, that's great, let's make it $2 trillion. And I remember that because I was in the White House with him when he committed to support a background checks bill and a ban on assault weapons, and he didn't mean that either. A day later, he was against both of those things. And so I just don't think we're going to be able to get this administration to deliver a big infrastructure bill, despite the fact that there are probably majorities in the House and the Senate to do that. But when that infrastructure bill comes, and I'm doubtful it comes under this administration, we've got to be ready with big ideas. I sent out a tweet the other day that got sort of an interesting amount of attention. The Mystic River Bridge was closed temporarily and an Amtrak train stopped. And I just sort of retweeted it and said, hey, FYI, the way that we finance rail in the Northeast is fundamentally broken and we have to totally refix it from the bottom up. And that didn't come out of nowhere. I've spent the last year building a new plan to finance rail infrastructure from Boston to Washington, D.C. And I'm close to unveiling that plan. I met with the governor and the Commissioner of Transportation here in Connecticut yesterday to talk about it. I want to be ready when this infrastructure bill comes to have Washington make a massive new investment in Connecticut. Not just a little bit more money for us to fix a couple more bridges and a couple more intersections. I want a big new amount of federal funding so that we can radically transform rail, so that you can get from New London down to New York in 60% the amount of time that it takes today, which I tell you would transform the entirety of the Connecticut shoreline if all of a sudden your times got shorter and shorter. So we're getting that plan ready. I don't think it's coming in the short term. I think it's probably coming in the next administration, but I want to be ready with something revolutionary at that time. Let me make sure. I'm sorry to cut you off, but I know that I got to run and you guys got to run. So let me make sure that I get a couple more questions in before I go. Yeah, well, yeah, if nobody's standing up, you can follow up.
I'm talking about getting somebody from Mystic to EB, or getting somebody from the highway down to Mystic. It's the local connections that make the long-term connections actually work.
Right, and I'm just saying, like, the federal government doesn't, the federal government just sends money to the state, right? And then the state decides how to spend that money. So in order for you to have more resources to do that, I've got to figure out a way to be able to get more money into the state so that they have more flexibility. And the state right now spends a ton of its money on rail because it doesn't get the funding it needs. So the more money I'm able to get into the state, the more money you have to do those projects. The federal government is never going to sort of micromanage or do individual grants for local projects like that. That's just not how the federal government works.
Thank you. I've come to a lot of the breakfast, and I'm really happy to hear you talk about the climate change issue. And often that's not talked about, and it's something that's going to affect every one of us. Can you talk about what the possibility of the success of this new Green Deal is, and any sort of form coming out? And if you just kind of elaborate on that. And also, is the EPA as like dysfunctional as we read about? Is there, are they going to be able to not be kind of sponsored by the fossil fuel industry? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, the answer to your second question is it's as dysfunctional as you read about. I mean, the administration has chosen to put the fossil fuel industry in charge of the agency that regulates the fossil fuel industry. I mean, we just put a lobbyist for the oil company in charge of the EPA, which is, I mean, it's unthinkable. I mean, there's always been a difference between Republicans and Democrats on the issue of the environment, not as much here in Connecticut, but nationally. But Republican administrations didn't put fossil fuel lobbyists in charge of the EPA, and that's what we have today. And so you're not going to get, anything progressive or environmentally friendly out of the EPA in the short run. We just sort of have to hope that we can hold the line. I think it's sort of interesting to me how the Green New Deal, has become this sort of interesting political hot button, given that it's, I don't know how many pages, it's not a piece of legislation. It's just a resolution that says basically climate change is a really big problem, and we have an opportunity to save the planet and create millions of jobs in the process. And so why don't we do that? And to me, that's a no-brainer, in part because Connecticut stands to benefit, right? I mean, Connecticut already has the world's top fuel cell companies. Connecticut already has some of the most innovative advanced battery companies. We have UTC located here that invests millions of dollars in renewable energy research. And so, you know, as a state that is going to be sort of a high-tech oriented state that already has renewable energy infrastructure, if we're spending money on greening up our economy, then we're going to be the beneficiary of that here in Connecticut. And you know, right now we're not in a good place. We're going the other way. As you probably saw yesterday, the president announced that we're no longer going to do climate science 100 years out. We're going to do climate science only about 30 or 40 years out. And that's just a deliberate attempt to disguise the problem, right? It is there's no reason to do that other than you are trying to sort of fool people into believing that the problem is not as big as it is. But ultimately, you know, even if people in Washington don't sort of buy the policy here, the politics point in only one direction. Young voters see no controversy in this issue. Young voters in this country know that their planet is at risk, and they want Congress's hair to be on fire. And so if you want to be elected going forward, you're going to have to care about this. You're going to have to make it a priority. And I've said from the beginning that I'm kind of agnostic as to what we do, but whatever we do has to be big. I voted for a cap and trade bill, you know, 10 years ago. I would support a good version of a carbon tax bill. I'd love tax credits for renewable energy. I mean, I'm open to lots of different ideas, but muddling along and thinking that the country that comprises 5% of the population and 25% of the world's pollution won't be at the forefront of the global conversation, that's just unacceptable to me. So again, I think it probably is going to take an election to, you know, reset the conversation on climate, but you know, I have to remain optimistic about this, and I am in part because I know where the next generation of Americans is on this.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, guys. Let me. Let me, as I step down, let me just, you know, once again, thank you for inviting me here, and just ask you to be in touch with me. Like I said, your input matters enormously to me. The things that I talked about working on in my opening remarks, I only work on because, you know, you all told me that this was important. I have fantastic staff. Emily Boucher, who's here with me there in the corner, sort of covers Eastern Connecticut for me in my office. She can link you up with all of the individual policy people that work on the things that you care about in my DC office. I hope that you all follow me on social media. Sometimes I tend to get a little overheated with my concern about what's happening to the country, but it's me. You know, when you're following me on social media, on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, you're not hearing my staff, you're hearing me, and sometimes that helps create that connection, and that's also a way to provide feedback as well. So once again, to the Chamber and to all of my friends here today, thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Have a great weekend.
And thank you all for being here today. I want to say thank you once again to our sponsors. You made this possible for us. I did hear from Senator Summers. She is stuck in Hartford. She was trying to make her way down here, but she wanted to send her regrets that she couldn't be with us. And before we close, I'd like to ask Tony Sheridan to come up and just say a few words. We've done we've had a nice partnership through this event, and we hope to keep that going.
Thank you, Peggy, and thank you, Al. This was really a great opportunity to share our resources and work together. We have another opportunity coming up next, I think it's next Wednesday at Cardinal Honda, Business After Hours, so please join us. And again, thank you, Peggy, and your team. Great job. Thank you.
And thanks for being here. We'll see you next year.